So the first thing we're going to do is either navigate to your file, either where it exists on Pluto, or if you're starting from the beginning, just open up Photoshop. You can make your canvas whatever size that you want. I'm going to go ahead and make a new file with my canvas being an 8 by 10. It's a really standard size. So I'm going to click File, New. And you can go ahead and take care of naming your file right out of the gate as we're opening up a new file. So I'm going to call this Garrett Shorty 1. And it's currently set to this default US paper letter, which is 8.5 by 11, standard paper size. I can go in and change these however I see fit. You can also change or adjust whether it's inches, pixels, millimeters, points, picas. The resolution, we're not going to worry about too much, but it's important that we make the note here that your resolution for things that are print or that are intending to go to print should stay around that 300 dpi or ppi, pixels per inch. Things that are going for the web or are only going to be on display devices and not ever really printed, you're going to want a resolution of 72 ppi. Difference being you have a lot less color information, so the file sizes are much smaller at 72 dpi. And so this is what keeps you from wanting to throw your tablet against the wall while you're waiting for a web page to load, because it's got massive images on it instead of web optimized 72 ppi images. My background contents, I'm going to actually set this to transparent. This is basically just going to give me that box grid in the background that says, hey, nothing's here. It can sometimes be easier if you have a solid layer, depending upon what the task is that you're doing. But for this, because we're going to be layering multiple things over top of each other, I'm just going to go ahead and leave this set to transparent. And then in terms of color profile and pixel aspect ratio, you should really never have to fidget with these too much. sRGB IEC 6196621. This is like a standard RGB color profile that has a very wide gamut, but it's not so excessive that we're not seeing all the colors on the screen. Sometimes the color gamuts are larger than what you're actually able to see. And then the square pixels, this is going to be if you were working with video in Photoshop. You can set this to like anamorphic or other like stretched pixels. We're just going to leave this set to square though. And then I'm going to go ahead and press OK. This will open up that new file, and you'll notice that it's got the name that I gave to it up here, but we've really never saved this file anywhere. It doesn't exist. It only exists in Photoshop. So I could start working, and I might get like an hour into working on this short assignment, and if I forget to save and Photoshop crashes because you've got like sparkles and glitters and unicorns farting rainbows, and you've got so many layers and you've put so much effort into making your short assignment in collage great that you forgot to save and it crashes, you've lost everything. There's no going back. So my first word of advice is save, and save often. It's always easier to go back to a version or a saved copy or a duplicate than what it is to just have to start all the way over. Okay? So right out of the gate, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to control where I'm saving it to. And since we've already named the file, we're also going to double check though to make sure that it's still naming it what we intended it to be named. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can either simply click on the file menu and then go down to save or save as. And if you want to do a hotkey, because I love hotkeys, it's Command-Shift-S. Command-Shift-S is the save as command, and it's always going to bring up this window that allows you to select where you're saving the document, and you can even choose to overwrite an older or previous version of the document with that save as command as well too. So it's just good practice to use save as, because this is going to allow you, say like you wanted to save your progress. I could save this as Garrett Short Assignment 1 Part B, and then Part C, and then Part D, as I'm making progress till I get to my final product. So if I ever get so far down the road and I'm like, you know what, I want to go back, I can always go back. Okay, so I hit this little flag fly out here so that I'm able to see the whole file structure to my system. And I always like to have it set on this third tab here that shows us the folder structure as it goes, that kind of hierarchy. And I'm probably not connected to Pluto, which of course I'm not. So I'm going to go ahead and connect to the server here really quick. And I'm going to go ahead and save this into Pluto, Spring 2015, DMD 105B. And I'm going to find my folder. Oh, I thought I had a folder. Well, since I don't have a folder, then I can show you how to make a new folder. Bottom left-hand corner of this dialog box, it says new folder here. Whatever the last folder that I've selected, it'll put the new folder inside of that selected folder. Okay? So since DMD 105B was the last selected folder, when I click new folder, I can name it my name. And see how it drops it into that next. And I'm going to make another new folder, Shorty1. And up here, this very top box, this is going to be the name of my file. You'll notice that currently it says .psd on the end of it. This is our file extension. That file extension tells us what type of file I'm about to save this as. Now, just because I go in here and change this to JPG or JPEG, this does not mean that it changes the file type to JPEG. It just simply leaves that extension in the name. If we're changing the file type, you actually have to change it in the format drop-down menu down here. Now you'll notice that if I change it to something like PNG, it'll automatically update that file extension up above. So what's more important than anything else when it comes to naming your file, don't worry about the extension. Name it what you intend to name it. And then select the file type, and it'll automatically put that extension there. So because we're going to work with multiple layers and we want to maintain this transparency, I'm going to continue to save this document as a Photoshop document. When you guys are working in Photoshop on your photos as we go through the rest of the semester, as you're working on the file and manipulating and changing, you're always going to save as a PSD. And then when you're done and you're ready to send it to print, that's when you save it finally as a JPEG. Okay, but not until the very absolute end. So now that I've got this set to PSD, there's a couple of boxes down here. If I select the as a copy box, it's always going to save a new copy of the file. It'll never overwrite the original file. The layers box, having this checked, it's going to preserve all of my layers. And then the embed color profile, this is just simply embedding the profile that we set. You can have different color profiles based on where your final output is. I've got different color profiles set up for my printers at the studio, and depending upon whether I'm printing on my Epson or my HP, I use different profile sets. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and push save. This next dialog box is going to pop up and it's going to ask you if you want to maximize your compatibility. Well, but of course, why would we want to limit our compatibility? So I'm going to leave that box checked and press OK. If you own Photoshop at home, I have this don't show again message checked because I don't ever have any other choice. In the 10 years that I've been using Photoshop, I've always leave it to maximize compatibility. Couldn't tell you a reason why you wouldn't. So now we've opened up a new document. We've made it the size that we intended to. We've set it as a Photoshop document. We've named it, saved it into the location where we intend to have it. So now we're ready to start plugging away and getting things onto the canvas and start making our collage. So one of the things that I required is that you spelled out your name with letters, kind of like the cutout letters from those ransom notes from a newspaper or something along those lines. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Firefox, go to Google here, and I'm just going to search the letter G. And look at this. I've got millions and millions and millions and millions of G's that are my personality, your personality, every other personality that exists underneath the sun. Let's see.
Did we have to spell it out,
It doesn't have to be like every letter is different. You can use bless you. Forever immortalized on YouTube. Well, that's not a G. Oh, all right, my G hat. Ooh, there's lots of G hats. So, I know that depending upon whether you're on a PC or what program you're in for your web browser, sometimes you can just drag and drop images right into Photoshop. I'm going to give this one a whirl. Might have to open up the original file. Nope, not letting me do it. So I'm going to save this image as, and then hit my little flag here. And I'll just save it right alongside of my PSD file, so that way I know all of the images that I'm grabbing exist inside of that same folder structure. So if I ever want to go back and put it back in, or I accidentally delete it and I need it again, I don't have to go hunting for it. Although it didn't seem very difficult to find a G hat. And then when I come back into Photoshop here, we have a couple of different options in terms of placing things into our canvas. I can either go to File, Place Embedded, or Place Linked. The difference between the two, if I place Embedded, it will take the pixels, it will copy them, and then it will paste it into the document. And then that's it. Those pixels exist inside of that document. But if I place a linked file, if anything changes to the original file, then it'll automatically copy those changes into my document the next time that I open it. So if I painted my G hat green, then when I open it up in Photoshop the next time, if it was a linked document, then it'll also make my G hat in my PSD document green as well too. Okay. So this place linked file is really, really a useful tool, especially for you web designers out there, because you might have images that you place in as placeholders, and then you might make changes or do some photoshopping or remove things that are distracting or maybe boost some colors or add something in, and then it just automatically updates the file. So nothing's different. You don't have to keep placing that file every time you make a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to actually just go ahead and place embedded. I don't need it to be linked. And apparently I didn't save the file either. So there's my G hat down on my canvas. As soon as I place something into Photoshop, okay, it's going to immediately start giving me the ability to free transform. It's going to allow me to resize this however I see fit to make it fit inside of my canvas, whether I want to stretch it larger or make it smaller. What's important is that we understand a few things. I can just click any corner and at free reign squish, distort, and otherwise destroy everything that was the integrity of this G hat before I got my hands on it. Now, the way to avoid doing this is by simply holding down the Shift key the whole time that you're making any kind of changes. Now, since I've started to resize this, I can always back up as well too. You can go back in your history inside of Photoshop by using Command-Option-Z. Or if you're on a PC, Control-Alt-Z. And then I'll explain the history states a little bit better. There's a couple of different ways to back up in the history. Control Z will also back up, but it backs up between specific states. So I'll better explain that here in a few minutes. So when I go to resize my G-hat, if I hold down the Shift key while I'm doing it, you'll notice that it locks that bottom left corner and everything else is resizing, and it doesn't matter where I move the mouse, it stays proportional as it goes up and down. Now, I want to let go of the mouse first and then let go of Shift. If you let go of Shift first, it'll start skewing and stretching and it won't constrain those proportions how we did in the beginning. Now there's a couple other options that you have here as well too as you start to free transform. You'll notice, like I said, if I start in one corner, it always locks the opposite corner in place and it doesn't allow me to move anything. Well, if I also, while I'm holding down the Shift key, hold down Option, or if you're on a PC, Alt, it'll scale in place. So it doesn't lock that corner down anymore. Now you can also, if you click on, instead of the corner, if you click on one of these middle brackets, obviously it's going to skew if you're not holding down anything, okay? But if you hold down Option, it'll skew from both sides. See how it didn't leave that left side locked? And then the same kind of goes for the up and down. Okay, it skews both sides. And then once again, if we hold Shift while holding Option on those sidebars, it's not going to do anything. Nothing changes. It's still the same motion. I'm going to resize my G-hat here a little bit. Go ahead and commit to those changes by pressing the check mark. Now, there are 20 different tools down the left side of this toolbar over here. And not only are there 20 different tools, but if you click on some of the tools that have the little white arrow in the bottom right corner and hold long enough, there's like 6 more tools that are nested underneath of them, okay? So when I tell you to grab a nested tool, you have to long click on one area to get the nested tools to show up. Now there are some tools in your toolbar that don't have anything that's nested underneath of them, like your selection tool up here at the top, okay? So this selection tool or move tool is up at the top, it's the first tool, and it's the general tool that you're going to use to be able to navigate anything around on the canvas. Now, you'll notice that my G-hat has a layer down here. It is its own layer, and it's the only thing currently in my document. So when I click and drag, it doesn't matter whether I click on the hat or not. When I click and drag, it's clicking and moving the layer. Okay? Now, for some of you, it's going to be really intuitive. When you click the mouse, you're going to want it to pick up the thing that you're clicking on. That makes sense, right? Well, by default, Photoshop does not allow you to do this. It will always stay on the layer that you currently have selected. So to show you this, I'm going to download another image here really quick. Find a letter A. Oh, that's very educational. I'm going to resize using Option and Shift to scale in place.
Don't type in the letter
And then I'm going to hit the check mark to commit those changes. And you'll notice that when I click and drag, even if I click on the hat, see how it's moving my letter A? Well, it's because my letter A layer is currently selected. Okay? This is enough confusion to make you want to throw your computer screen out the window. If you do not have this auto select box that is very randomly placed at the top of the screen and very discreetly marked, not giving you any information as to what exactly it does, it's not going to allow you to select objects just by simply clicking on them. But if I check that checkbox, now when I click on my G-hat, you'll notice that it automatically selected the layer that my G-hat is on. So if I click on the A, it automatically selected my letter A layer. So this can work in your benefit, or this can work against you. It's personal preference at this point as to whether you want the auto select on. I'll be perfectly honest, I like leaving my auto select off and just navigating through my layers. Now you can very quickly navigate through your different layers by using hotkeys. Imagine that. I like using hotkeys. So you can actually change what layer you have currently selected by using Option or Alt if you're on a PC, left bracket or right bracket. So your thumb on the Option key and then the left bracket and right bracket, you'll notice that right bracket moves up, left bracket moves down. So you can just quickly select through your layers by using that hotkey. I can grab my hat, I can grab my letter A, and I'm just navigating right through. Okay? Now, as we're placing things onto our canvas, you may want to go back and change the size of something. You realize, maybe I left this a little too big, or maybe I wish it was a little bit smaller. Well, if I wanted to make my letter A a little bit smaller, because I don't need it necessarily the same size as my hat, I need it to be the same size as the G that's perhaps on my hat, I can make sure that that layer is selected, as it's highlighted in blue here, and I can go to Edit, Free Transform, or you'll notice that the hotkey here is just Command T. So if I press Command T, you'll notice that our box that was there when we first placed our document into our short assignment here, that is now back around that layer. And it's going to allow me to come in and start free transforming once again. Now, I'll tell you it's good practice. You typically are not going to want to scale things larger than what they're placed into the document. And we'll cover this as we get a little bit later in the semester. But basically what you're doing by making something bigger than what it originally was is now you're hoping that Photoshop can make good judgment calls as to putting extra pixels into that image. So what it's doing is it's literally grabbing pixels from like Magic Pixel Land out in the far, far nether regions of the universe, and it's just cramming them into this document as it sees fit. Personally, I don't like to give Photoshop that kind of control. Okay? It's just bad practice. Now that I got my letter A at a more reasonable size, I'll go ahead and commit by pressing that check mark. And you'll notice that my letter A, unlike my G hat, has this like heinous white square around it, right? And this could be the simplest but most difficult thing for people to understand in Photoshop. But I promise you, I'm teaching it to you now because it's something that's going to take you the rest of this semester and probably the rest of the next like 2 years that you use Photoshop to really master the ability to mask things, okay? But it is the core process of how Photoshop works. It allows you the ability to turn on and off pixels or pixel adjustments at your free will, okay? And it happens so very simply on a very rudimentary scale that it's really difficult to comprehend. It's as simple as if something is black, it's turned off. If it's white, it's turned on. Think of a light bulb in a room with a switch. If you turn the switch off, the room becomes black. If you turn the switch on, the room becomes white. Okay? So we can add a layer mask to things in our layers panel. Down underneath here, once again, we have these like 6 icons that are very discreetly marked and don't give you any indication as to what they are. Well, Photoshop will actually give you little points, little hits. If you leave your mouse hovering over top of something long enough, it'll actually tell you a little snippet of what it is that it's going to do. So if I leave it hovering over top of the FX button, it's going to say add a layer. Add a layer style, I'm sorry. If I hover over the box with the circle, add a layer mask. Create a new fill layer, so on and so forth, all the way down and across. What we're looking for is actually to add a layer mask. Now, click it once, it adds a layer mask. Click it twice, you'll notice that now, as my mouse hovers over top of it, it says add a vector mask. This is different and a layer mask. Okay. So if I were to click this one more time, you'll notice in my layers panel, I have the layer, a link, a box that's solid white, another link, and then another box that's solid white. If you see two boxes, you've done something wrong. You've clicked it twice and you now have a vector mask. You do not want a vector mask. So I'm going to back up by pressing Command Option Z, and it'll back up one time, and now you'll notice that my box is gone. I only have one. I have that layer mask. To back up, if you're on a PC, it's Control Alt Z. No. Control Z backs up a history state. Control Option or Control Alt Z backs up one history movement, which I'll explain to you here soon. Let me keep going here a little bit further and I'll show you the difference. So now, once I've added my layer mask, like I said, you'll notice that the box is currently all white. And that's because all those pixels are turned on. So we see everything that's on that layer. So if I were to go over here and maybe grab my paint bucket tool and choose my foreground color to be black. If I painted it black, now my box is black, you'll notice my A has disappeared. But if I paint it white, it shows back up. That is your digital light switch inside of Photoshop that allows you to turn pixels on and off. Okay. Now, with a paint bucket tool, obviously I'm just like slapping down a bunch of black or slapping down a bunch of white, and I've got no control over what's happening. But if I use my brush tool, which is over here on the left, if you hit your hotkey B on the keyboard, just B as in boy or B as in brush, it'll select your brush tool. You'll notice that it gives you this kind of like crosshair. Now, I can make my brush bigger or smaller by using that same bracket key that we were using earlier to navigate through our layers. No other keys, just the bracket key. So the right bracket is making my brush bigger. The left bracket is making my brush smaller. Now we also have some other options. If we were to left click on the canvas, it's also going to give us this dialog box that allows us to control the size of our brush. But it's also going to give us the ability to change the hardness of our brush. So to give you a little understanding what the hardness does, if I have the hardness turned to 0 and I draw a line, see how it's kind of fuzzy around the edges? There's this like general gradient. Now if I were to turn the hardness all the way to 100%, now when I draw my line, see how it's thick, rigid? There's strict edges. There doesn't have this like nice, easy gradient that transitions from the black into the transparent background.
What do you click again to make it to adjust it?
If you just right click on the canvas. You can also bring down this menu by clicking up in this top left panel up here where it says 140 currently. That same menu shows up by hitting that drop down. Now you can also change like the shape of the brush. So there's like different like paint brushes that actually look like paint brushes and so on and so forth. You can download a bazillion and one from the internet and load them into Photoshop as you see fit. Some people have brush palettes that just go on for days. I'll be perfectly honest, the brush that I use is the simple default circular brush for anything and everything that I do. Now, back to our layer mask. You'll notice that if I select different layers, there's this bracket that exists as I'm selecting layers. And I can change where that bracket is lying by clicking on the different thumbnails. That bracket is telling you where you're active in terms of your layers and in terms of the layer or the mask or the vector mask. So because I'm going to be changing or manipulating the mask to turn off some pixels because I want to get rid of that white that exists around my A, I'm going to make sure that I have my layer mask selected before anything else. Now obviously I'm pretty far away from my A. My A is small on my canvas here, and so I want to zoom in so that I can see what I'm doing. You can do this by using hotkeys, which I'm a big fan of, or you can do this by using the zoom tool, which is located in the panel to the far left. 4 up from the bottom, it's the magnifying glass. Okay, so by using the magnifying glass, I can click and drag left or right, and it's zooming in and out. So depending upon where I click, if I drag to the right, I can zoom in that specific area, which is kind of useful, right? You can hop between your zoom tool and your brush tool by using hotkey B to go to the brush or hotkey Z to go to your zoom tool. Or if you don't want to switch to a different tool, you can use hotkey Command plus to zoom in or Command minus to zoom out. And if you're on a PC, it's Control plus to zoom in, Control minus to zoom out. So as I'm zooming in, I zoomed in on a part of the canvas that has absolutely nothing in it. And if I try and click to move my canvas, I'm just using my brush. It's not moving my canvas for me. Well, there's a key, or there's a tool, the hand tool, that allows you to click on your canvas and move things around, okay? That hand tool exists right above the zoom tool here, and now when I click on my canvas, I can shuffle it around and move wherever I see fit. Once again, it's not conducive to being efficient if you have to go to the tool panel, select a new tool, go back to the canvas and continue working. You can do this, you can bring up this move tool or this hand tool by just simply pressing the space bar on your keyboard. And every time, or as long as I'm holding it down, I'm currently using the move tool or the hand tool. And when I let go of the space bar, I go right back to my brush. So this is a quick way to be able to navigate around your canvas if you have to move somewhere. So you don't have to use the little scroll bars or on the top or the bottom. And you don't have to use your mouse, because if you had a real mouse like a Mac mouse, you can scroll left and right instead of just up and down like typical PC mouses. So now that I've got my brush tool and I've got what I intend to be working on front and center on my canvas here in front of me, nice and large so that I can see what I'm doing, now we're going to start turning those pixels on and off. Now our brush tool, right now my brush tool, it tells me that my foreground color is white and my background color is black. Now the difference between your foreground color and your background color, it's almost like you have a color and then a color in reserve that you can always switch to. Bless you. To switch those two colors at any given time, all you got to do is use the hotkey X. See how it rotates my black forward and back? Now, if I had some crazy colors here like red, oh, mayday. I selected red. Why are you not red? Oh, because I'm on my layer mask. If I had some crazy color here selected like red and green, very Christmassy, how festive, right? If I wanted to go back to having just black and white, the default color palette, all you got to do is press D on the keyboard, like dog or default. So I'm going to make sure my layer mask is selected. I'm going to make sure that I have my default color palette. And if I'm wanting to turn pixels off, can you guess what color I'm going to want to paint with? Turning pixels off, we're going to want to use black. So I'm going to make sure that my brush foreground color is black. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller here so that I can handle some of the detail. And as I'm painting on my layer mask, I'm turning those pixels off. Now, if your pixels don't just disappear altogether, it might be because the opacity of your brush is turned down. So if I have, instead of 100%, 50%, this will only turn the pixels half off. It's almost like I'm just using a gray brush instead of a black brush. So now when I go in here and I start turning off these pixels, you'll notice there's kind of like a haze of white. It's not completely gone. I can take this all the way down to 1% if I want. I think I can take it all the way down to 0.5% if I want. And then the changes are so minute. Okay? But I'm just going to go ahead and leave this set at 100. Because all I'm doing is going through here and clearing out some of this white that exists around my letter A. Now, I took a slice out of the back of his head there. I can back up. I can back up actually 20 times. That is the default set by Photoshop. You can increase the number of history states that Photoshop records in the general settings, but you get 20 by default. So if you have something going wrong, don't just keep pushing forward. Stop, back up, and then proceed. Because if you start clicking wildly on the canvas 60 bazillion times trying to figure out what's going on or why it's not working, well, guess what? You've effectively now ruined your ability to go back, okay? So if I press Command Option Z, it will back up one history state at a time. So you'll notice that if I keep pressing it, eventually I'll get back to my original state of my letter A before I made any changes whatsoever. Now you can see you're navigating through the history states by bringing out your history panel. There are like a bazillion panels in Photoshop, and they're all buried everywhere, and they're all very discreetly marked with no words and just these very like obscure foreign symbols. Well, we could spend 10 hours going through and hovering over top of everything that's in the interface trying to find the history panel. Or you can simply click on Window, and if there's not a check mark next to one of these list items, that means that it is currently not open or it's not showing you that it's there. So if I want to look at my history, if I just click on History, it pops that history panel out. So I don't have to spend 15 minutes mystery meat clicking around, searching and wondering what I'm going to find. Now I can extend out these panels and make them as big as I want. They're just like any other window on a regular computer. But you'll notice that my history state is currently 6 moves up above what the very bottom of it was. So if I continue to press Command Option Z, it's going to continue to keep going back and back and back and back in history, all the way past that free transform and some of the movements that I made. Now, Nora, this is where the Control Z or Command Z comes into play. Command or Control Option Z moves you one state at a time, one history state at a time. Now, because I've backed all the way up, like 10 or 15 history states here, if I were to press Control Z, what it'll do is it'll jump between that spot where I stopped and where I left off, where I started. So like say I want to make some changes and then back up and hop quickly back and forth between those changes to see if I like them, if I want to commit to them, then that's where you use Command or Control Z. Yes?
How do you get rid of that like blurry thing that you do when you're erasing it? That really annoys me.
That's the hardness of the brush.
Right, okay.
So you would just adjust the brush to be harder and it'll get rid of that gradient so it won't be quite as blurry. So I'm going to go ahead and set in my history state spot right before I started working on my layer mask. I'm going to come back in here, and this time I'm going to be a little bit more careful as I'm going around. Now I'm just going to move very quickly here. I'm actually going to make my brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to turn the hardness down so it's not such a strict edge, maybe a little bit softer. Oh, mayday. I can turn my hardness back up now that I'm back on some detail.
My hardness was at 100 and it's
If your hardness is at 100, then it's your brush. Change your brush tip. You've got some custom brush probably selected. Now the beautiful thing about using a layer mask to turn your pixels on and off, you'll notice that when I get up into a corner like this, where the brush just doesn't fit because it's round, okay, so if I take and get rid of the corner, make sure that it's completely gone, I got rid of all the white pixels that existed there, I can just very simply switch to turning the pixels on by pressing the X key, or now bringing white as my foreground color. So now anything that I paint white is going to turn back on. I can come back on the top side of this and bring back my corner, so I've got a tight corner by working in the opposite direction. So then I can hit my X key again, hop back over to black, so that I'm erasing my pixels. So I could continue to spend more time going in and deleting more of these pixels, or I'm sorry, not deleting, turning them off because they're never gone. This is what we refer to as non-destructive editing. I'm making changes, but I'm not committing to them forever. I can always go back in on my layer mask and paint it all white, and then everything's turned back on. So you've never done anything that you can't undo. Okay? That's key. As you guys are working in Photoshop, this should be standard practice. This kind of don't dig yourself a hole deeper than what you have a rope to climb back out of is more true than it ever has been. Okay? You never want to dig yourself into a pixel hole that you can't climb back out of, because then what you've effectively done is you've worked for 2.5 hours on something and you've lost it because you've done destructive editing and you can't go back and get something. And nothing is more painful than having to start over because of your mistake. So now that I've got most of my white removed from my A, I'm going to zoom out using Control or Command minus. I'm going to grab my Move tool or the arrow tool or hotkey V like Victor. And now you'll notice that my A no longer has that heinous white box around it anymore. It's just simply the A. There's no white. So now I can keep going, grabbing more images, placing them onto the canvas, using a mask, using my transform tool to scale and size and turn those pixels on and off. And eventually when you're all said and done, you should have 20 elements that exist inside of this, and your name should be spelled out somewhere.